Let's start by understanding what NextJS is, what are the core features of NextJS, and what's new in NextJS 13. Now, NextJS is a React framework. React is a JavaScript library for building UIs. And by UIs, I mean user interfaces, pages, components, your website, the client side of your application. Now, by framework, we mean that it enhances React with features that are missing in React. For example, if you're building a naked React application, it does not come with a router. For routing, meaning that the client or the user can be able to navigate between different pages of your app, you need a third-party package like React Router together with React to create different routes. Now, NextJS comes built in with a router, so you don't need an extra third-party library. Plus that it is a file system based router, meaning that you would create different routes and pages on your site by creating files and folders in your code base. For example, if you want to render about page, you create an about folder. Inside of it, a page.js or TS would be responsible for rendering /about on your site. Let's look at the core NextJS features. In my opinion, there are three main features of NextJS. One is routing that we touched on. Second is pre-rendering, which is divided to static generation and server-side rendering. And lastly, the API endpoints. We've already talked about the routing. So it comes built in and it's a file system-based router. Now let's see, what do we mean by pre-rendering? Now when you're using a naked React application, again, the initial HTML coming as a response to the user's browser is an empty HTML template file. It's only when React code or JavaScript is downloaded in the browser that it generates the content of that page. In contrast, in NextJS, we pre-generate this HTML on the server and send it to the user with our response. So the difference is, instead of having an empty HTML file, we now have HTML with data rendered on the server and sent to the client. Now this pre-rendering can happen at two different times. First is at build time. So when you are creating a production bundle of your application, you run a build script and you build and generate these HTML files, you fetch the necessary data, and then you host these static HTML files as a static files, and that's called static generation. The second option is to generate the HTML at request time. So every time a user accesses your site or a specific page in your app, you render that page on the server, generate the HTML at request time, fetch the necessary data, and then send the generated HTML to the user, to the client, and that's called the server-side rendering. So this pre-rendering, meaning that static generation and server-side rendering, is an added feature to a React app. React doesn't have static generation in and of it itself. It doesn't have server-side rendering in and of it itself. Until React Server Components was introduced in React 18, React itself didn't have any way to render your components on the server. Before getting into React Server Components, which is a feature in NextJS 13 we'll talk about shortly, let's cover the third core feature of NextJS, which is API endpoints. Now, traditionally for a React application, if you wanted to do any backend logic, you had to create a whole separate server application, like in Express, and expose some API endpoints, which you could call from your React frontend application, from where you would just do any backend logic that you want, connect to a database or fetch third-party services, and then communicate with your front-end. Now in Next.js, you don't need that separate server application. You can just create API endpoints from within your Next.js application. Now in Next.js 12, you would create an API folder inside of your pages directory, and anything in that API folder would turn into API endpoints. In the app router, you can accomplish the same thing by creating route handlers, which are like API endpoints that you can just put in anywhere inside your app router to turn that segment into an API endpoint. Now let's talk about what's new in Next.js 13. Now Next.js 13 introduced the new app router, which is built on top of React Server Components and Suspense. With React Server Components, you can fully render your components on the server. This is a feature now coming in React 18. This is no longer Next.js rendering or generating your HTML on the server side. It's actually your components rendering fully on the server. And the difference is in Next.js 12 and in the pages directory where we would server render our components or our pages, we would still ship JavaScript to the client, to the browser to hydrate our page. But with React Server Components or in Next.js 13 with the app router, no JavaScript is actually shipped to the browser, to the user. Everything remains on the server, which reduces the bundle that we're sending to the client. Therefore, it makes our application faster and more performant. Any third-party library remains on the server. React code responsible to rendering and templating your pages remains on your server. And the only thing sent to the client is the generated HTML. Now, if you need any client-side interactivity, any event listeners, or you need to access the browser APIs, you can use client components with the use of the use client directive to add only those features to the components that actually need them and ship less JavaScript to the user. Again, as mentioned, this makes your application fast and more performant because you're not shipping the React code and Next.js runtime to the browser for rendering your components. Also, in the app router with Next.js 13 and Suspense, we have streaming, which means we are able to send partial HTML as it is generated on the server to the browser. So therefore, once the user opens up the page, they can see different parts of the HTML coming together as they're getting ready or streamed in from your server. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to build our first Next.js application. We're going to then talk about styling, specifically Tailwind CSS, and we're going to deploy that application to Vercel, which allows us to see our site and progress throughout this lesson and modules live on the web.